Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Christopher Koopman, Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, to dig into the growth of the sharing economy. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Bill.
Chris, in the most general sense, what is the sharing economy?
The easiest way to think about the sharing economy is as a class of firms that is providing a series of platforms for people who have things to connect with people who want things. So the easiest example of this is Uber. Uber is providing a platform for people who have cars and spare time to connect with people who want rides. Or Airbnb is a platform for people who have a open couch or a free bedroom or someone willing to rent out their entire apartment or home to connect with people who are looking for a non-hotel type place to stay while they travel.
And what about services like TaskRabbit and, services like that?
Yeah, so TaskRabbit and Thumbtack and a whole class of firms. Really the big firms in this are Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, but there are a lot of other firms beyond that. So like you said, TaskRabbit is one that allows people who have spare time to put themselves out there on the TaskRabbit platform and connect with people who need help with odd jobs. For example, if I'm moving, I could get onto TaskRabbit and find people who are capable movers or people who are just willing to help me box my stuff and connect with them and use their free time to help create value for me and turn their time into a profit opportunity.
Is getting more benefit from underutilized resources a little bit like getting more benefit through energy efficiency? I mean, in both cases, additional investment in new resources is generally not required.
The value of Uber is in its ability to connect people. These are things that are already lying around. There are people who have cars. There are people who have spare time. Uber isn't buying cars and investing in a fleet of vehicles. Uber is simply connecting people who already have those cars and, like you said, are underutilized. They're not using them all the time, and it's giving them an opportunity to put that underutilized resource to work for themselves and also connecting them with people who want to use that resource. So you think also there are other sharing economy apps like Feastly and Eat With that are people who have cooking abilities and some degree of hospitality, and they will invite you into their home and cook for you. So for someone like me who's not a very good cook, I can get a home-cooked meal through Feastly or Eat With, or they'll come to my house and cook for me. So it's giving people opportunities to take what they already have and put it to productive use.
Why are entrenched special interests so desperate to regulate the sharing economy?
So the fight over the existence of the sharing economy has been one that's been going on for, about a year and a half, 2 years, as Uber and Lyft in particular have grown into the for-hire transportation markets around the country. And this is really an existential threat to the old way of doing business. Taxi companies have had a stranglehold on the for-hire transportation service sector for 80 years. Since state and local regulators chased the jitneys out in 1930.
Yeah, LaGuardia.
It's been taxis and nothing else for the most part, unless you wanted a limousine or a black car service. But what Uber and Lyft do is they provide people an alternative to the old way of doing business, and they provide people a more responsive service. They provide people, in some cases, a cheaper service, and they provide people choice and competition, which really benefits consumers and cuts into the market share and the profits of the established firms and the established industries that have really benefited from the current regulatory structure.
But how can regulations hurt consumers? After all, aren't we told that regulations are designed to protect consumers?
Most regulations have a consumer protection justification. So you think about most of the regulations that exist in taxi cabs and that taxi cabs are trying to have extended to ride-sharing services and ride-sharing firms. They've been justified under a consumer protection guise that somehow these regulations are protecting consumers from being harmed by the people that are giving them rides. They're going to charge them too much. They're going to take them the wrong direction. They're going to take advantage of them somehow. So we need these regulations to protect them. But really what they've done, maybe some of them were in fact passed and implemented with the consumer at heart, but a lot of those over time have transitioned into a way to more or less protect competitors as opposed to protecting consumers. And some of them were simply always about protecting competitors, and they were just justified or sold to the public as a way to protect consumers.
I don't understand because I've been riding taxis for years, and I've met a lot of rude, lousy cab drivers driving filthy, stinking cabs. That's never happened to me once on Uber.
You think in the old way of doing for-hire transportation, let's say in a world without Uber, all you had were taxis, and it was extremely difficult, extremely expensive, and in some instances, impossible for new competition to enter that market. So incumbent firms, incumbent taxi companies, and incumbent taxi drivers have no incentive to be responsive to consumers, in particular because there's no real threat that they'll lose business to a competitor because competitors don't exist.
Uber's been much in the news lately. French cab drivers have decided that burning Uber cars and beating up their drivers is the right way to respond to competition. And the French government has responded not by arresting the people committing the violence, but by arresting the top Uber executives. What's going on over there?
Europe has had a much different response to ride sharing than the United States has. You saw some protests and some, for lack of a better term, some acts of public frustration on the part of taxi services and taxi drivers, but you haven't seen the level of violence that's being experienced in Europe. And it's not just France, there are other countries as well where taxi drivers are actually pulling passengers and Uber drivers out of the cars and beating them up. And what you're really seeing is just a complete disregard for really consumers. That is sort of the antithesis of consumer protection in that regard. But what you're really seeing, I think, is a sort of night and day response to innovation. So taxi drivers are frustrated, but you're seeing taxi drivers in the United States respond and try to innovate to compete with Uber. Recently, Red Top Cab Company in Northern Virginia, where I'm located at George Mason, they released their own app to try to compete with Uber.
Wow.
You're not seeing that in Europe. You're seeing, instead of trying to compete Uber and Lyft out of business, they're just going to try to
shut them down,
outright destroy Uber and Lyft. And you're even seeing that with the regulators as well.
So California bureaucrats seem to be taking a different approach in their efforts to destroy Uber. They're going after their business model by ruling that Uber contractors are really employees. Talk to us about that.
As I mentioned before, the fight over the existence of ride-sharing and the sharing economy has been going on for, the past couple years as Uber and Lyft and Airbnb have grown sort of exponentially over the past 24 months or 36 months. That debate over whether or not the sharing economy should exist is pretty much settled. The sharing economy is here to stay. Ride-sharing is not going anywhere. So now you're seeing all of these second-order issues come to the forefront.
So what is it with the labor ruling in California?
What happened in California is earlier this year, the California Labor Commissioner sided with an Uber driver saying that she was an employee rather than an independent contractor. She had driven with Uber for some time and was seeking reimbursement for miles as well as tolls and other various expenses that she had incurred as a result of driving for Uber, and she wanted Uber to pay for those. The California Labor Commissioner agreed and said in this case she was an Uber employee and she was entitled to reimbursement. This isn't the first time this has happened. The Florida Department of Economic Opportunity recently also sided with an Uber driver saying that the driver was an employee for the purposes of unemployment insurance. It really is an existential threat in some ways to the sharing economy model. So the sharing economy model is not that you have these big, large, clunky firms providing service, but you have a sleek platform that is connecting individuals with other individuals to provide goods and services to the people who need them.
What's wrong with extending the benefits of labor regulation to people in the sharing economy? Aren't these regulations designed to protect them?
There are people that would say that this is good for Uber drivers to be classified as employees, but designating drivers as employees or other sharing economy participants as employees of the platforms rather than contractors would involve enormous costs, and they're going to come at the expense of consumer welfare, competition, and opportunity for those very individuals seeking to work through those platforms. So by increasing the cost of operation, this is only going to reduce, for Uber, for example, the number of drivers who can participate in the ride-sharing platform. In particular, Uber's not going to carry as many employees as it's currently carrying Uber partners. Uber recently, a board member for Uber said Uber has around 300,000 drivers worldwide and is onboarding approximately 50,000 a month. Uber isn't going to continue to grow at that pace if they have to incur all the costs of employing them rather than just simply connecting them with people who want rides. So the type of costs that Uber and other sharing economy firms would have to incur are things like overtime pay, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, Social Security benefits, family leave. For ride-sharing companies in particular, they're going to have to reimburse drivers for operating expenses, so ordinary maintenance and repairs on their cars, the cost of fuel, tolls, mileage reimbursements, and all sorts of other costs. And all this is really going to do is shrink and reduce the overall size of the pie in the sharing economy. You're going to have less people able to work in the sharing economy because firms aren't going to want to pay the cost of employing them. But they're also, the cost of employing these people will be passed on to sharing economy consumers in higher prices.
So, Chris, taxi medallions in big cities like New York used to sell for $1 million. The advent of services like Uber and Lyft seem to be driving prices down. Isn't this unfair to medallion investors?
Yeah, it's an interesting public policy issue. Recently, the one of the largest taxi medallion holders in New York was pleading with the city of New York to bail him out to the tune of $1 billion in lost value, saying he was as systemically important to New York City's economy as AIG, so he's just as worthy of a bailout.
I love it.
Yeah, it's an interesting position, for policymakers to find themselves in because they created the mess themselves. By creating the medallion in the first place, they sort of trapped taxi drivers in this difficult position where the first generation of taxi drivers may have benefited from the medallions, but over time, the benefits that you get from purchasing a medallion is capitalized in the cost of purchasing the medallion itself.
Sure.
So over time, these taxi drivers are paying all the benefits of being a taxi driver up front in increased cost for a medallion. So now you have these taxi drivers who are saying, we will be hurt if you remove the benefits of us having a taxi medallion. And they've never really gotten the full benefit that came from the privilege of having a medallion in the first place.
I mean, after all, they paid to have their competitors arrested. They want their money's worth.
Exactly. They incurred a lot of costs for this quasi-monopoly privilege. And it's only natural that they would expect that quasi-monopoly privilege to continue into the future.
So speaking about buying privileges, in the end, can Uber solve many of its problems by making appropriate campaign contributions to politicians? I mean, after all, that's how regulated competitors gain support.
Yeah, perhaps, but I think the issue in the sharing economy isn't whether Uber should survive. It isn't whether Lyft should survive or any single sharing economy app should survive and be a part of the regulated system. It's what is the regulatory approach that will benefit consumers the most. So yes, Uber could, in fact, win over politicians and get themselves inducted into the club, if you will, and extend the regulations to protect them from further competition down the road. But for policymakers who are truly, genuinely interested in increasing consumer protection, increasing consumer welfare, and really looking out for the little guy, they really ought to be thinking about how do we create a system that is sustainable long-term and isn't just a short-term solution for today's problem.
Well, good luck convincing politicians to do that. Hasn't Virginia just passed its first law favoring Uber?
Yes. As of July 1st, Virginia's Transportation Network Company law went into effect. And this is, in essence, a huge benefit to established ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft because it creates all sorts of artificial barriers to entry for new ride-sharing startups to enter the market and compete with the big guys. In particular, the Virginia TNC law includes a $100,000 fee for the license and then a $60,000 fee every year after that to renew the license, which is a huge cost if you think that sometimes these apps are just a couple of guys sitting around that come up with a great idea.
They got to pinch that off.
And before they can even test that idea, they have to come up with $100,000 to deploy the app in Richmond, Virginia, or Arlington, Virginia, for example.
Oh, Uber must be thrilled.
Both Uber and Lyft heralded the TNC law as good and pro competition and pro ride sharing, but really it's pro Uber and pro Lyft.
And I'm sure they'll express their appreciation to the appropriate politicians. Chris, let's move on to Airbnb. Remind our listeners how that works.
Sure. So Airbnb, just like Uber and Lyft and these other sharing economy firms, it's a platform to connect people who want to take a spare room or their entire apartment or their entire home and rent it out on a short-term basis to people looking to stay in that area. So, for example, let's say you have a 2-bedroom apartment and you typically only use one of the bedrooms. You could use Airbnb to list that second bedroom as a short-term rental listing on the Airbnb platform, and people who are coming into town or tourists or anyone for that matter
Students
could then connect with you and rent that bedroom from you on a short-term basis.
Hotel operators are complaining about unfair competition because Airbnb renters often dodge onerous hotel taxes. I mean, in New York, these can add up to over 16%. Do the hotels have a legitimate beef?
I think just like the taxis complaining about ride sharing, the hotels complaining about Airbnb, what this really is the sharing economy is putting a humongous spotlight on bad, inefficient public policies. It is just, I mean, it's making these issues unavoidable because so many people are getting so much value out of these services that the services just simply aren't going to go away. So it puts public policymakers in a really tough spot where they have incumbent firms and industries saying, you need to do something about this, and you have all of these people and potential voters saying, we love these services, do not ban them. So it puts them in a really awkward position in terms of how do they both make incumbent firms and industries happy, but then at the same time ensure that they aren't going to destroy this whole innovative sector of firms that are creating a lot of value for people across the country.
I mean, I understand that Airbnb has become so lucrative in some cities that landlords are beginning to utilize it full-time instead of renting their apartments to long-term tenants. And this can also be used to dodge rent control. Isn't this unfair to tenants?
I'm not sure it's unfair to tenants. Again, what it really shows is the inefficiency of rent control regulations, and it really shows the inefficiency of a lot of these regulations where people say we're doing this for the benefit of the tenant, but at the end of the day, what it's really doing is incentivizing landlords or what have you to put that property to other more productive use. It's now making that use as a long-term rental inefficient. It's making it unlucrative or, making it just unattractive venue for them to use their property. So now they're going where it's otherwise, more efficient for them to use their property.
Why do progressives seem to have such a problem with the sharing economy? Aren't they all about sharing?
When you hear, especially people who are typically in favor of government regulations, they typically also seem to be in favor of people connecting, and they talk about community, and they talk about sharing and all of these issues. But what the sharing economy really is, it's an existential threat to regulators, and it's an existential threat to the idea of public interest regulation. And it's showing people that there are private solutions to problems, and government doesn't always have to be involved in fixing them. Take, for example, Las Vegas, Nevada. Uber, in a matter of months, was able to solve the problem of long hauling, that is, taking tourists from the airport to the Las Vegas Strip the long way. Uber was able to solve that problem in a matter of months, and regulators in Nevada still have not. They've had 5 or 6 decades now to fix that problem, and they still haven't figured out how to do it.
Yeah, give the out-of-towners a tour of the city on the way to the hotel.
Yeah, exactly. In a lot of these instances, even in D.C., for example, the D.C. cab union is up in arms right now because D.C. Taxi Commission is about 18 months behind consumer complaints. So, for example, let's say I get in a taxi cab and I'm driven to the wrong place. They drop me off at the wrong location, or they verbally assault me, or they take advantage of me in some way. I file a complaint with the D.C. Taxi Commission. Sometimes it takes them 1.5 years to finally notify the driver that I have filed a complaint against him or her. Drivers are saying, well, that was 18 months ago. How am I supposed to remember that ride? And indeed, I think they have a valid complaint there, and it's showing just how awkward, inefficient, and clunky the regulated solution can be when you think with Uber, with a touch of a button, and a couple of minutes, my problem is solved.
Yeah, bad ratings and they're gone. Progressive commentators have criticized Uber for its use of surge pricing. I mean, the idea that prices should go up when demand exceeds supply, say when it's raining, seems to drive them crazy. They call it gouging, sort of like when the hardware store raises the price of shovels during a snowstorm. Do they have a point?
I think people who complain about surge pricing really misunderstand the role of prices. In its simplest sense, prices are incentives, and prices are signals, and prices encourage people to provide that service. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I'm a driver and I'm in an area where there are a lot of drivers and I see there's another area without a lot of drivers and I could get surge pricing if I go to that neighborhood, well, I'm encouraged to go provide that service in that neighborhood that otherwise doesn't have a car in the area. Mm-hmm. It's encouraging drivers to go provide that service. And it's also allowing, especially when you think if you charge one price to everyone all of the time, there are some times when people are going to be overpaying for a taxi, especially in a world like Uber where there's variable pricing. It moves up and down depending on supply and demand. By Uber charging surge pricing, they may actually be able to charge other people less and make it more affordable for people to get the services that they want.
Oh, it usually is cheaper when it's not raining out, that's for sure. So when you sum it all up, what's wrong with having some states and cities regulate the sharing economy services out of business while others embrace them? I mean, isn't that what the so-called laboratory of democracy is supposed to be all about? I mean, if the people of California or Portland want to kill off Uber and Airbnb, what's wrong with giving the voters what they want?
In a lot of cases, these aren't elected officials making these decisions. These are unelected bureaucrats. These are regulators. And these are people who are not responsive to voters making a decision as to what is best for people. Recently, a survey came out that 80 million Americans are transacting in the sharing economy, and nearly 90% of them are doing it because they say it makes life more affordable. So for policymakers, especially in states and cities where they're trying to regulate the sharing economy away, I think they're going to have a hard case to make to the people who stand to benefit the most, let's say lower income individuals or folks that are looking for opportunities in the sharing economy, to explain to them why they aren't able to have those opportunities while other people around the country are able to benefit to the degree that they are.
Well, Chris, thanks for bringing us up to date on this vibrant sector of the entrepreneurial economy, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
That was Christopher Koopman from the Mercatus Center here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program now airing in 10 cities nationwide. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.